This chicken enclosure is pretty elaborate and it has a lot of functionality. And in this video, I'm going to walk through the design so you can recreate it or utilize some of the techniques in your own chicken enclosures. And here we can see it fully finished and it's got the coops inside. It's got the feeders, everything inside. It's fully decked out and it's really awesome. But we're going to go through and utilize this last photo here to kind of break down this because it doesn't have the doors attached. And then we'll talk about the doors at the end and how you could secure those in place. But this is a really fantastic build, and this comes from R&D. They shared this through email not too long ago, and essentially this is just a large rectangular box. And if you don't know what materials these are, this is EMT conduit and maker pipe connectors. You can get EMT conduit off the shelf at places like Home Depot, Lowe's, Do It Best, True Value, and pretty much any hardware and home improvement store that has an electrical aisle and electrical supplies. And you can cut EMT conduit to size with a handheld rotating pipe and tube cutter. It's really easy to do, and you can customize projects to whatever dimensions you need. So I'm not really going to talk about dimensions in this build or in this breakdown. I'm kind of just going to explain how you can put it together, and then you can customize the dimensions based on whatever needs you might have. But essentially, this entire thing is made with that EMT electrical conduit, and I believe it's 3/4 inch EMT that they used. And then the fittings that you see here are clamps that we manufacture in upstate South Carolina, and these are made of steel, and they're made to be combined with EMT conduit for projects like this, and you don't have to do any welding or use any special tools or skills. They just utilize a 5mm Allen key to go together. And so that's essentially the main two materials that you'll need to build the framework, and then you can customize and use different netting that you might need for your enclosure based on exactly the dimensions that you want for the kind of holes of the material and the netting. Some people aren't really worried about different animals depending on where they live, so you might can use larger holes, might be less expensive. I won't really get into all that, but you can kind of customize that based on what you need as well. But I just want to break down the frames, the frame itself and the connectors and different things so you can kind of understand how to build something like this, because a large project might seem kind of daunting like this to recreate, but it's actually not too complicated. So we're just going to go through and talk about it and kind of break it down. So we'll start with the vertical poles, and usually when creating a large rectangle like this, we see pretty much the same connectors. I mean, we can see the same design used in a batting cage, for example, where it's very similar. And we're kind of just going to start on this outer edge, and this wall on this side is going to be the exact same as the other wall. They're pretty much just mirrored. And essentially, it's just a vertical pole with two pieces of EMT conduit going horizontally between those two vertical poles, as we can see here. And then there's a connection that they're using to join those pieces of conduit together, and those are the maker pipe 90-degree connectors, which are pretty much going to be the standard fitting that you're going to use if you're creating a three-dimensional box like this. And the 90-degree connector joins three pieces of EMT conduit together. And so the other piece of conduit is terminating inside of the 90 on this side and then extending all the way to the other wall that I said is mirrored exactly like this one. And essentially, this is how you can create a large rectangular box if you want to do it this way. Now, normally you can find EMT conduit in a 10-foot length, but you won't want to leave conduit unsupported in that long of a span. So what you'll want to do is break up the span and add some vertical post as well. And we can see exactly that is what R&D did whenever they built this. And we can see that they did that pretty frequently. They actually added a vertical pole several times. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in between the two that are on the end. So 7 in total. And when you're doing this, you kind of have two options depending on the length of the span that you want. So from what I can tell, it looks like this isn't any longer than 10 feet. So if you're not doing anything longer than 10 feet, you don't technically have to break up that horizontal span. Or if you want it to be longer than 10 foot, then you can break it up and kind of extend this forever and ever as long as you want, pretty much, to get the dimensions that you want. But it looks like, from what I can tell, this actually is one long continuous piece of conduit. I imagine it's probably pretty close to that 10 foot, if not 10 foot. And then they used a maker pipe 180-degree connector we can see on where these verticals are. And the reason I said you can kind of customize this depending on the dimensions is you can choose to either break up a horizontal span or the vertical in these kinds of projects. And if you're going for a longer length, then you're going to break up the horizontal. But if you're keeping it within that 10-foot constraint, then you'll want to break up the vertical, which is what they did. And what I mean by break up is because the connectors clamp around the conduit, you have to kind of cut sections out so that the connector can fit in between those two pieces of conduit and kind of take take up that space without having to drill through or do any welding or anything like that. So essentially the 180-degree connector is splitting up these vertical posts all the way down. So that horizontal piece, that green pipe we marked there, is running continuously through it, but these vertical posts are providing support to the structure, but they're broken up here to allow that piece of conduit to run continuously through all the way to the other side. And it's nice and simple, and like I said, what you'd want to do if you're working within a 10-foot measurement, but then you can kind of flip over this design and use the 180 and keep the vertical post all one piece of conduit, and then break up that horizontal to then add length to the build. And that's essentially a technique that you can kind of customize depending on your specific needs. But that's how the walls are created, using those 180-degree connectors. And then here we can also see sometimes that they used a different connector other than the 180. And so this might be a little confusing, but the 4-way connector from MakerPipe is very similar to the 180-degree connector, where it functions in the same way, where it allows a piece of conduit, this green piece, to run continuously through it, and it also allows these red pieces of conduit to come out of and kind of be at 180 degrees, but it also allows, as we can see here, another piece of conduit to terminate in it and then extend. And that's where they added these partitions in different areas of the chicken coop. So it looks like they have 3 areas, and they partitioned these 3 areas from each other, and they utilized the MakerPipe 4-way connector to do that. And essentially, like I said, it's very similar to the 180. It just has a couple different pieces that allows it to have that extra pipe coming out of it. And that's what they use there to create the partition and kind of separate these 3 areas. So not too complicated, and you don't even have to do that. If you wanted to just be one large enclosure, you could use all 180s, but if you do want to create those partitions like they did, then you can use the 4-way connectors as we can see there. And so because they did that, they essentially have this wall that is in the middle of the frame, and they just use the MakerPipe T connector to just grab on here and to attach this partition and this wall. As we can see over here, that's a T connector as well, and essentially just kind of frames out the doorway that they have in between each area. So this looks kind of complicated, but essentially just create that main rectangular box, and then you can add the 4-way connector instead of the 180 anywhere that you want to add that partition. And we'll look at that closer here in a second whenever we look at the doors. But essentially that's pretty much the main part of the frame, except we can also see here that they added some angled bracing, and they did that using the MakerPipe 45-degree connectors, which are just a rigid angle that are used to add bracing to projects like this. And you can just create those angled braces to just provide support where needed in the different areas of the build that you're trying to support appropriately. And then we can also see they use MakerPipe T connectors to grab on and add some of these horizontal braces as well that extend to the gate. And essentially those partitions are built the exact same way, where instead of this being a 90 for the partition, it's the 4-way connector as I explained, and that piece of conduit just extends to the middle of the build, and then they grab on with a T connector and just basically frame out the doorway in between the areas. And that's exactly how they did it back here and where they have this partition at. And so that's how you could do that on the walls out here for the gate to get inside, and as well as the partitions. That's pretty much it. Both sides, the front and the back, are made this exact same way with these connectors, and then the rest of the walls are made the exact same way and mirrored on the other side as well. But essentially that's the main part of the frame, and here we can see kind of the top and bottom of the frame. I guess this is probably just the top, not the bottom. They don't have netting on the bottom, but this is the roof of the frame where we can kind of see those connectors. And I don't know if I actually highlighted that part of it on the roof, which is probably going to be different than the walls, where instead of this using a 180-degree connector at the very top to extend the frame, they're actually adding a roof to this. So this long horizontal span is running continuously through it, the same way it was on the wall that we looked at. And then the difference is, instead of it being 180-degree connectors to kind of extend this frame and go, they use 90-degree connectors, which essentially is just going to allow that vertical post that we saw going up to the roof, and then the other piece extending and going out to the middle where they have the partitions and the different things in the frame. So utilizing 90s in this way is really helpful to be able to do that and just kind of create that roof structure that supports the netting on top of the build. I forgot to mention that when we were looking at this picture picture a minute ago. But essentially that's how they did the roof. And then I guess at the very bottom, I don't think I mentioned, they kind of did something different where they don't have to really worry about adding all those pipes across, although I think they did actually, because I can see it in the grass faintly back there. So if you don't want to do this, you don't have to, if you want to keep pipes from running in the middle of the enclosure. But it looks like they did, where they use 9Ds again, and that just allows them to do what we just talked about, where it just grabs on and then extends this piece running from one side to the other here, from the 9D across all the way to the other side, and just adds those supports from one side to the other. So you could do that pretty simply with the 90-degree connectors, or like I said, you could just use something like a T connector if you just want to, add that vertical support on the walls without adding that cross support on the very bottom floorboard of the enclosure. So just something to keep in mind, a few different techniques. And I know this is kind of a lot, but you can check out this photo here and kind of see the different connectors that they used. It looks like we can also see they used a 5-way connector, and I imagine this is where the partition is. And this just creates that vertical post that runs down to the ground, and allows them to kind of support that appropriately with the roof and everything. So it looks like a mixture of 5-way connectors there, as well as it looks like 180-degree connectors that we talked about in different places to kind of support this roof and make this kind of grid panel. So, pretty extensive, pretty complex build. It looks like a lot, especially when you see it finished like this. But if you kind of break it down and go through step by step, you can recreate this and see which connectors you need and kind of get the total quantities. And of course, if you have any questions, let me know. But here we can kind of see the total enclosure kind of all finished. And he said that they used doors from this Wings Avian Products Company, and they have these metal doors here. It looks like they're about $114 a piece, and they include the framing, as you can see here, and the hinges and everything to make the door. And it looks like they just added a piece of like angle iron or flat stock, or some maybe even unistrut going from EMT conduit, or one side of the EMT conduit frame to the other. And it looks like a bolt just running continuously through the EMT from one side of the wall to the other, and then attaching that. And that just created that flat mounting point so they could attach these doors. And they did that here on the ends, as well as in the middle partition, as well as we can see. And then they added some chicken coops in there. They added the feeders and mounted those. Looks like they're just sitting. Actually, I think they're hanging off of the enclosure netting as well. So that's really cool, nice and simple. And then, of course, the whole frame has the netting around it. Looks like they just used zip ties to secure the chicken netting to the frame, which is pretty simple. And, you can do that pretty easily just based on the chicken netting that you're using, as we talked about earlier. And all in all, like I said, it looks kind of complex. It is pretty elaborate, but it is something that you can recreate. And, of course, if you have any questions or need any help, you can reach out to us, and we'll do our best to do that. And feel free to leave any comments down below. If you enjoyed this and found it helpful, leave a like and consider subscribing. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.